There are moments in life that arrive like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Slow at first, just shadows and light, until the image sharpens into something you cannot unsee. This is the story of one such moment, and how it changed everything I thought I knew about friendship, about desire, and about the careful distance I had learned to keep from my own heart. It was past 10 on a Thursday night, and the laundromat on Fifth Street hummed with the steady rhythm of machines that never sleep. I had claimed the corner folding table, my usual spot when insomnia drove me from my apartment to seek the strange comfort of fluorescent lights and the company of strangers' clothes tumbling in endless cycles. The heat from the dryers had fogged the windows, turning the outside world into a blur of streetlights and shadow. I was folding my work shirts with the methodical precision of someone who finds peace in small rituals. Each crease aligned, each sleeve smoothed flat. The cotton still held warmth from the machines, and I pressed my palms against it, letting the heat anchor me to the present moment. This was my Thursday night meditation, my quiet rebellion against the week's accumulated weight. The door chimed as it opened, bringing with it a gust of October air that carried the scent of rain and dying leaves. I looked up, expecting to see Mrs. Chun from the apartment complex, or maybe one of the college students who haunted this place during finals week. Instead, I saw Damien. He stood in the doorway for a moment too long, as though reconsidering his decision to enter. His dark hair was damp from the mist outside, and his jacket hung open despite the cold. There was something different about his posture, something that made my hands pause mid-fold. In the 11 years I had known Damien Keller, I had seen him angry, drunk, elated, exhausted. I had seen him laugh until he couldn't breathe and sit in silence for hours on end. But I had never seen him look uncertain. He walked toward me with none of his usual easy swagger, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under his eyes, making him look older than his 34 years. When he reached the folding table, he didn't sit on the bench across from me like he normally would. Instead, he leaned against the industrial dryer to my right, close enough that I could smell the familiar combination of motor oil and the cologne he had been wearing since college. I waited for him to speak, to crack some joke about finding me in a laundromat at 10:30 on a weeknight, to ask if I had finally given up on my apartment's temperamental washing machine. That was our rhythm, our comfortable dance of sarcasm and shared observations about the absurdity of adult life. But Damien said nothing. He just watched me fold, his gaze heavy with something I could not name. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the mechanical symphony of washers and dryers. I folded another shirt, then another, my movements becoming more deliberate under his scrutiny. Finally, I looked up and met his eyes. "I had this dream about you," he said. His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its typical confidence. "I can't stop thinking about it." I laughed, a short sound that echoed off the tile walls. I was already constructing the response he expected, already preparing to hear about some ridiculous scenario involving zombies or flying cars, or the time we got lost hiking and ended up sleeping in his truck. Damien's dreams were legendary among our circle of friends, elaborate productions that he recounted with theatrical flair over morning coffee or late-night beers. But he did not laugh with me. He did not launch into his usual animated storytelling, complete with exaggerated gestures and impersonations. Instead, he looked down at his boots, worn leather that had carried him through 1,000 adventures, and rubbed the back of his neck in a gesture I recognized as nervous habit. "It wasn't like that," he said, still not meeting my eyes. "It was different." The air in the laundromat shifted, becoming thicker, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the static from the dryers. The steady hum of the machines suddenly felt too loud, as though someone had turned up the volume on a song I'd been hearing but not truly listening to. I tried to fold another shirt, but my hands had forgotten their purpose. The cotton slipped between my fingers, falling back into the basket in a wrinkled heap. Something was happening here, something that went beyond the boundaries of our carefully maintained friendship. I could feel it in the way Damien's breathing had changed, in the careful distance he was keeping between us despite standing so close. It was in the words he was not saying, in the dream he was not describing. When he finally looked up and met my gaze, I saw something I had never seen before in those dark eyes. It was vulnerability, yes, but more than that. It was recognition, as though he had discovered something about himself that surprised him, something that both terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. The look lasted only a moment before he glanced away, but it was enough to make my chest tighten with an emotion I was not ready to examine. I wanted to ask him what kind of dream could leave such an impact. What images had lodged themselves so deeply in his consciousness that they drove him from his apartment to find me in a laundromat at nearly 11 o'clock on a school night. I wanted to know why he looked at me as though seeing me for the first time, why the easy camaraderie that had sustained us for over a decade suddenly felt inadequate, too small to contain whatever was expanding between us. But before I could form the questions, before I could find the courage to voice them, Damien straightened and cleared his throat. "How was your week?" he asked, his tone forcibly casual. The mask of normalcy slipped back into place so smoothly that I almost convinced myself I had imagined the previous exchange. Almost. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential. My student's latest essays, his ongoing battle with a particularly stubborn carburetor, the weather, the way the city had changed since we first moved here as idealistic 20-somethings. But beneath the surface conversation, something else pulsed like a second heartbeat. Every casual gesture felt loaded with meaning. When he handed me a shirt that had fallen to the floor, our fingers brushed for a fraction of a second too long. When I laughed at his story about a customer who insisted her car was possessed, he watched my mouth with an intensity that made me forget the punchline. Eventually, my laundry was folded and his excuses for staying had run out. We walked to the parking lot together, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. His truck sat under a streetlight, the metal surface beaded with moisture from the fog that had rolled in while we talked. My car was parked 3 spaces away, close enough that we could have said good night and walked away, but we lingered. I should get going, he said, but made no move toward his truck. Yeah, I agreed, making no move toward my car. We stood there in the damp October night, 2 grown men suddenly awkward with each other in a way we had never been before. The air between us hummed with unfinished sentences and unasked questions. I could hear the distant sound of traffic on the main road, the occasional car passing in the night, but the world felt smaller somehow, compressed down to just the 2 of us under that pale streetlight. "See you this weekend?" he asked, finally breaking the spell. "Of course," I said, though I was not sure anything would be quite the same. He nodded, seemed about to say something else, then thought better of it. Instead, he reached out and touched my shoulder briefly, a gesture that might have been casual if not for the way his hand lingered, the way his eyes searched my face as though memorizing it. Then he was walking away, climbing into his truck, starting the engine. I watched his taillights disappear into the fog and stood there long after the sound of his truck had faded. When I finally got into my car, my hand was shaking. As I drove home through the empty streets, I kept replaying the moment when he looked at me, really looked at me, with something I had never allowed myself to recognize before. The dream he would not describe hung between us now, a secret that had changed the very air we breathed. And somewhere deep in my chest, in a place I had learned to keep carefully locked, something that felt dangerously like hope began to unfurl its wings. I did not know then that this was only the beginning, that the careful architecture of our friendship was already crumbling, making room for something larger and more terrifying and infinitely more beautiful than either of us had dared to imagine. All I knew was that Damien had dreamed about me, and that dream had been different, and that nothing would ever be quite the same. The morning after the laundromat, I woke in my narrow bed to the familiar sounds of the city stirring below. My apartment sits above Henderson's used books, a cramped space that smells perpetually of old paper and the coffee I brew each morning in the same chipped ceramic mug I have owned since graduate school. The mug is white with a faded blue rim, a small crack running down one side that I trace with my thumb while I wait for the coffee to steep. This is my life at 32. Predictable, contained, safe. I rise at 6:15 and shuffle to the kitchen in bare feet, the hardwood floors cold against my skin. I make my coffee strong and black, stand at the window that faces east, and watch the sun climb over the low buildings across the street. Below, Mrs. Henderson unlocks the bookstore, her gray hair pinned in the same neat bun she has worn for the 15 years I have lived above her shop. My morning routine is a meditation of sorts. Coffee, shower, toast with jam, made by a woman who sells preserves at the Saturday farmer's market. I grade papers at my kitchen table before the day begins, red pen moving across essays about Gatsby and Holden Caulfield. Young voices try to make sense of stories older than they are. By 7:30, I am dressed in the uniform of my profession, pressed khakis, button-down shirt, the same brown leather satchel I have carried since my first teaching job. The high school where I work is a brick building that has stood for 60 years, its hallways echoing with the particular sound of adolescent energy barely contained. I teach sophomore and junior literature, and after 8 years in these classrooms, I know the rhythm of teenage attention spans, the way their faces change when a poem finally clicks, the careful distance I must maintain between caring and caring too much. My students see me as steady, reliable Mr. Rowan who never raises his voice, who explains metaphors with patience, who remembers their names and asks about their sick grandmothers. What they do not see is how I sometimes stand in my classroom window during lunch, watching the parking lot and wondering if this quiet life I have built is enough, or simply all I have allowed myself to want. Damien is everything I am not. Where I move through the world with careful deliberation, he attacks it head-on. He works at Morrison's garage on the south side of town, his hands always stained with grease, his forearms marked with small scars from years of wrestling with engines that fight back. He lives in a converted warehouse apartment with exposed brick walls and windows that stretch from floor to ceiling, a space that feels more like an art installation than a home. We met in college, both of us English majors, though we approached literature from opposite ends of the spectrum. I wrote careful, analytical papers about symbolism and structure. Damien wrote passionate, sprawling arguments about the souls of characters, the way Steinbeck made him feel homesick for places he had never been. Our professor paired us for a project on modern poetry, and somehow we found a rhythm that worked. My precision balanced his intensity. His fire warmed my caution. After graduation, we both stayed in town, though for different reasons. I stayed because I had found work, because the city felt manageable, because leaving required a kind of courage I was not sure I possessed. Damien stayed because he loved the contradiction of it, the way you could find wilderness 20 minutes from downtown, the way the local music scene thrived in converted warehouses and basement bars. Our friendship settled into comfortable patterns over the years. Damien would appear at my apartment without warning, sprawling across my couch with the boneless ease of someone who had never questioned his welcome anywhere. He would bring stories from the garage, tales of eccentric customers and impossible repair jobs, and I would make dinner while he talked, our conversation flowing around shared references and inside jokes accumulated over a decade. On weekends, he would drag me out of my natural hibernation, hiking trails that wound up into the mountains where the air thinned and the city disappeared below us. Late-night drives to diners that served coffee strong enough to keep us awake until dawn. Concerts in venues where the music was too loud and the crowd pressed too close. But Damien's enthusiasm was infectious, his joy in experiencing everything the world offered making even my discomfort feel worthwhile. He has always been tactile in a way that seemed natural, unremarkable. An arm slung across my shoulders when he told a particularly animated story. His hand on my back when guiding me through a crowded room. The way he would lean close when showing me something on his phone, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. I told myself this was simply his way, that Damien touched everyone like this, that the flutter in my chest when he did it was nothing more than surprise. But now, sitting in my kitchen with my morning coffee, watching steam rise from the chipped mug, I find myself examining our friendship with new eyes. The easy intimacy that had felt so natural suddenly seems loaded with possibility. Every casual touch, every moment when his gaze lingered a second too long, every time he chose to spend his evening on my couch instead of anywhere else in the city. The laundromat conversation has shifted something fundamental between us like a photograph coming into focus. I replay his words obsessively. I had this dream about you. It wasn't like that. It was different. What kind of different? What had he seen in that dream that left him looking at me with such raw vulnerability? I think about calling him, but what would I say? I think about texting something casual, testing the waters, but my thumb hovers over the keyboard without pressing send. Instead, I go to work, teach my classes, grade papers, maintain the careful routine that has anchored my life for years. But underneath the surface of normalcy, something has awakened. Something that whispers that maybe the safe, contained life I have built is not protection at all, but a prison I have constructed from my own fears. That evening, I stand at my kitchen window watching the street below, and I wonder if Damien is somewhere across town wondering the same things I'm wondering. If he is replaying our conversation, examining our history, trying to decode what that dream meant and why it felt important enough to share. The thought makes my chest tight with something that might be anticipation or might be terror. I do not know yet that within days, he will offer me a chance to find out. 3 days passed before Damien called. 3 days during which I moved through my routine with a heightened awareness of my phone, checking it between classes, during lunch, in the quiet moments before sleep. When his name finally appeared on my screen Friday afternoon, I stared at it through 2 rings before answering. "Hey," he said, and his voice carried none of the uncertainty from the laundromat. Instead, it held that familiar warmth that had anchored so many of our conversations over the years. "You busy this weekend?" The question was casual, but I heard something underneath it, a deliberate lightness that suggested he had rehearsed this call. I was grading papers in my kitchen, red pen poised over an essay about symbolism in The Great Gatsby, but the words on the page had already lost their meaning. "Not particularly," I said, which was both true and an understatement. My weekends had become exercises in productive solitude, carefully planned activities designed to make the time pass pleasantly alone. "Good. I need a favor." His pause felt weighted, as though he was gathering courage for what came next. "You remember my family's old place up at Miller Lake?" I did remember. We had been there once during college, a spontaneous trip during spring break when his parents were out of town. The cabin had felt massive to my 20-year-old eyes, all knotty pine walls and windows that looked out onto water, so still it reflected the sky like a mirror. We had spent 3 days there drinking beer and reading books on the dock. Our friendship still new enough that comfortable silence felt like an achievement. "It's falling apart," he continued. "I mean, really falling apart. The porch is rotting through. Half the floorboards are warped, and I'm pretty sure something's living in the walls. But my dad keeps talking about selling it, and I can't let that happen. Not yet." There was something in his voice when he said this, a tenderness that suggested the cabin meant more to him than simple family nostalgia. I waited for him to explain, but instead he shifted direction. "Anyway, I figured I'd head up there this weekend, try to make a dent in the repairs. Could use the company if you're interested. And the help, if I'm being honest." I should have said yes immediately. We had spent countless weekends on similar adventures, Damien's restless energy finding projects that needed our attention. But something made me hesitate, some instinct that recognized this invitation as different from the others. Maybe it was the careful way he had presented it, as though the outcome mattered more than he was letting on. Maybe it was the memory of how he had looked at me in the laundromat, that moment of vulnerability that had lodged itself under my skin. "Sure," I said finally. "Sounds like it could be fun." "Great." His relief was audible. "I'll pick you up around 8 tomorrow morning." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the essay I had been grading, but the words seemed to belong to another language. Instead, I found myself thinking about that weekend in college, the way the morning mist had hung over the lake like breath made visible, the sound of loons calling across the water at dusk. I remembered how Damien had seemed different there, more settled somehow, as though the place allowed him to exist at a slower pace than the world typically demanded. Saturday morning arrived gray and cool, October asserting itself with the kind of weather that promised winter was not far behind. I packed a bag with work clothes and warm layers, though I could not shake the feeling that I was preparing for something more significant than a weekend of repairs. When Damien's truck pulled up outside the bookstore, I was already waiting on the sidewalk. He looked tired as I climbed into the passenger seat, his hair uncombed and stubble darkening his jaw. But his smile was genuine, and when he handed me a cup of coffee from the gas station, our fingers brushed in a way that felt both accidental and inevitable. "Thanks for coming," he said as we pulled away from the curb. "I know it's not exactly a glamorous weekend. When have any of our weekends been glamorous?" I asked, and he laughed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. The drive to the lake took 2 hours through country that grew more rural with each mile. We talked easily about work, about mutual friends, about the book I was reading and the podcast he had been obsessed with lately. But periodically, conversation would lapse, and I would catch him glancing at me out of the corner of his eye, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel in a rhythm that spoke of nervous energy. As we climbed into the mountains, the air grew thinner and sharper, carrying the scent of pine and the particular freshness that comes with altitude. When we finally turned onto the dirt road that led to the cabin, my chest tightened with recognition. The trees were taller than I remembered, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the gray light into patterns of shadow and pale gold. The cabin sat exactly as I remembered it, perched on a small rise that sloped down to the water. But Damien had not exaggerated its condition. The front porch sagged visibly, and several of the windows were covered with plywood. The roof showed patches where shingles had been lost to weather and time. "It's worse than I thought," he said, cutting the engine. We sat there for a moment, taking in the scope of the work ahead of us. But the lake beyond the cabin was unchanged. It stretched away from us like a sheet of hammered pewter under the cloudy sky, surrounded by hills that rolled up into mountains, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds. The sight of it made something in my chest loosen, a tension I had not realized I was carrying. We unloaded our bags and surveyed the damage more closely. The list of repairs was daunting, but Damien attacked it with characteristic determination. We spent the afternoon replacing rotten floorboards on the porch, the work making our shoulders ache and our hands rough with splinters. He had brought tools and materials, and we fell into an easy rhythm, measuring and cutting and hammering while classic rock played from his Bluetooth speaker. As the day wore on, I began to notice the way Damien moved differently here, with less of the restless energy that typically drove him. His gestures were more deliberate, his focus more sustained. When he paused to survey our progress, looking out over the lake with satisfaction, I saw something in his expression that I recognized but could not name. That evening, we built a fire in the stone fireplace and sat on the old couch with beers, our muscles pleasantly sore from the day's work. The fire painted the room in warm light, and for the first time since the laundromat, the silence between us felt comfortable rather than charged. "You know," he said eventually, staring into the flames, "I used to come here when I needed to think. In high school, college, whenever life felt too complicated." I waited for him to continue, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "It's the only place I've ever felt completely myself," he said quietly, like I didn't have to perform for anyone or pretend to be something I wasn't. The words hung between us, heavy with implication. I thought about the dream he had mentioned, the one he had been unable to stop thinking about. I wondered if this place had been the setting for whatever his subconscious had been trying to tell him. "What was the dream about?" I asked, the question emerging before I could stop it. He turned to look at me then, firelight flickering across his features, and for a moment I thought he might actually answer. But then he smiled, shook his head, and took a long drink from his beer. "Maybe someday I'll tell you," he said, "when I understand it better myself." But his eyes held mine longer than necessary, and in that look I saw the same recognition I had glimpsed in the laundromat. Something was building between us, something that this place and this weekend had brought closer to the surface. As I lay in a narrow bed in the cabin's single bedroom later that night, listening to Damien settling onto the couch in the main room, I wondered if understanding was exactly what we were both afraid of. Morning came wrapped in mist that rose from the lake like breath made visible. I woke to the sound of coffee brewing and found Damien already dressed, standing at the kitchen window with his back to me. The early light caught the edges of his hair, and for a moment I allowed myself to simply watch him, to notice the way his shoulders moved beneath his flannel shirt, the careful way he held his mug as though warming his hands. He turned when he heard me stirring, and his smile was softer than usual, unguarded in the way that morning light sometimes makes possible. "Sleep well?" he asked, and there was something in his voice, a tenderness that made the simple question feel more intimate than it should have. I nodded, accepting the coffee he offered, and our fingers lingered when I took the mug from his hands. It was such a small thing, barely a moment, but I felt the touch echo through my chest long after he had turned away. We worked differently that second day. Where yesterday had been about assessment and urgent repairs, today felt more deliberate, more collaborative. When Damien handed me tools, his fingers would brush mine with what seemed like intention. When we measured boards together, he would stand closer than necessary, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, smell the combination of sawdust and sweat that had become the scent of this weekend. At one point, while we were replacing a section of damaged siding, I caught him watching me with an expression I could not quite decipher. It was not the easy familiarity of our usual interactions, but something more intense, more searching. When I met his eyes, he did not look away immediately as he might have before. Instead, he held my gaze for several heartbeats, and I saw something there that made my pulse quicken. "You have sawdust in your hair," he said finally, reaching out to brush it away. His fingers grazed my temple, lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, and I felt that touch like an electric current running down my spine. We broke for lunch around noon, sitting on the newly repaired porch with sandwiches and cold beer. The mist had burned off, revealing the lake in full autumn glory, its surface reflecting the gold and crimson of the trees that surrounded it. Damien leaned back against the porch railing, one leg stretched out, watching me with a half-smile that seemed to contain secrets. "This place suits you," he said unexpectedly. "You look different here." "Different how?" I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to know the answer. "More relaxed. More yourself." He took a drink from his beer, considering his words. "In town, you always seem like you're holding something back. But here, you're just present." The observation unsettled me because it felt true. There was something about this place, about being away from the careful routine of my daily life, that made me feel more solid somehow, more real. But I was not ready to examine why that might be, or what it said about the life I had constructed back in the city. "Maybe it's just the absence of papers to grade," I said, deflecting with humor the way I always did when conversations veered too close to truth. Damien laughed, but his eyes remained serious. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe it's something else." That afternoon, the weather began to shift. Clouds gathered on the western horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. We worked faster, trying to finish the most urgent repairs before the storm arrived, but by 4 o'clock, the first fat drops were already falling. We gathered our tools and retreated inside, just as the sky opened up. Rain hammered against the cabin's metal roof with a sound like applause, and the windows fogged with condensation that turned the outside world into impressionist smears of green and gray. The electricity flickered once, twice, then died completely, leaving us in the gray half-light of the storm. Damien found an old deck of cards in a kitchen drawer, and we settled at the small dining table to wait out the weather. We played poker with matches for stakes, the conversation flowing easily around the rhythm of dealing and betting. But as the afternoon wore on and the storm showed no signs of abating, our talk grew more personal, more intimate than it usually did. He told me about feeling stuck in his life, about the way certain people could change everything without warning, about dreams that felt more real than waking, about the strange alchemy of longing that could transform the familiar into something entirely new. I listened to the careful way he chose his words, heard the subtext beneath them, and felt something shifting in the space between us. When the power flickered back on briefly, then died again for good, we moved to the living room. Damien built up the fire while I lit candles I'd found in the kitchen, and soon the room was bathed in warm, golden light that made everything feel softer, more forgiving. We sat on the couch with fresh beers, closer than we had the night before, our knees almost touching. The storm raged outside, but inside felt safe, protected, removed from the ordinary world and its expectations. In the dream, Damien said suddenly, his voice so quiet I almost missed it over the sound of rain. We were here, at the cabin, but it wasn't like this. I waited, not daring to speak, afraid that any response might cause him to retreat back into safer territory. We were older, he continued, staring into the fire. Or maybe not older, just different, more honest, maybe. And you looked at me like you knew everything about me and still stayed. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with possibility and fear. I could feel him watching me, gauging my reaction, ready to laugh it off if I gave him any reason to doubt the wisdom of this confession. But I did not laugh. I did not deflect or change the subject or retreat into the comfortable distance that had protected our friendship for so many years. Instead, I turned to meet his gaze, and in the firelight, with the storm creating a cocoon around us, I let him see something I had kept hidden for longer than I cared to admit. How honest? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The question seemed to surprise him, as though he had expected me to pull away, to restore the careful boundaries we had always maintained. Instead, he saw recognition in my eyes, saw that perhaps I had been carrying dreams of my own, dreams I had never allowed myself to examine too closely. Honest enough to say that I think about you more than I should, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was admitting. Honest enough to wonder what would happen if we stopped pretending we're just friends. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, visible and insubstantial at the same time. I felt my heart beating against my ribs, felt the careful architecture of our friendship reshaping itself around this new truth. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the roof and windows, but inside, in the warm circle of firelight, something entirely new was being born. I reached for my beer with hands that were not quite steady, taking a long drink while I tried to process what had just happened. When I set the bottle down, Damien was still watching me, waiting for some sign of how I would respond to this fundamental shift in the landscape between us. I think I said carefully that we might both be more honest here than we've ever allowed ourselves to be anywhere else. It was not quite an answer, but it was not a retreat either. And in the way his shoulders relaxed, in the small smile that curved his lips, I saw that he understood. We were standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain, and for the first time in either of our lives, we were both brave enough to look over the edge. We stayed up too late that night, feeding the fire and finding excuses to avoid the moment when we would have to separate, when he would retreat to the couch and I would close the bedroom door between us. The conversation had shifted after his confession, becoming both more careful and more honest, as though we were learning a new language that required precision we had never needed before. When we finally said goodnight, our hands brushed as he took my empty beer bottle, and neither of us pulled away immediately. The touch lasted only seconds, but it carried the weight of everything we had admitted and everything we still could not bring ourselves to say. I lay awake in the narrow bed, listening to him settle onto the couch in the next room, the old springs creaking under his weight. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt almost solid. Through the bedroom window, I could see stars reflected on the lake's surface, doubled points of light that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams that felt too vivid to be dreams. Images of hands reaching through darkness, of voices calling across water, of a warmth that felt like coming home to a place I had never been. I woke several times, disoriented, my heart racing with emotions I could not name. The third time I woke, the room was still dark, but I could hear movement from the main room. Soft footsteps, the quiet sound of the door opening. I lay still, listening, until curiosity overcame caution and I slipped from bed to look out the window. Damien sat on the porch in the darkness, wrapped in one of the cabin's old quilts, staring out at the lake. The moon had set, but starlight was enough to outline his silhouette against the water. There was something in his posture, a stillness that spoke of deep thought or maybe sleeplessness, that made my chest tighten with concern. I pulled on clothes and joined him outside, the October air sharp enough to make me catch my breath. He looked up when I settled beside him on the porch steps, but he did not seem surprised to see me. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Too quiet. I said, though that was not entirely true. The silence was part of it, but mostly it was the way our conversation had left everything suspended between us, unfinished and electric with possibility. We sat without speaking for several minutes, watching the lake reflect starlight like scattered diamonds. The air smelled of pine and the lingering moisture from the storm, clean and sharp in a way that made everything feel heightened, more real. I keep thinking about that dream, Damien said eventually. Not the details of it, but the feeling, the way everything felt so right. He paused, gathering courage for what came next. It didn't feel like a dream, he continued. It felt like something I remembered, like a life I might have lived if I had been braver. The words hung between us in the cold air, visible as breath. I could feel him watching me, waiting for some response, but I was struggling with my own revelations, my own half-remembered dreams that suddenly seemed less like imagination and more like prophecy. What did you remember? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He was quiet for so long, I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, carefully, as though he was translating from a language he was still learning to speak. I remembered what it felt like to wake up next to someone who knew me completely. I remembered the way you looked when you thought I wasn't watching, like you were seeing something in me I didn't even know was there. I remembered feeling like I didn't have to choose between who I was and who I thought I should be. The confession hit me like a physical force, making my breath catch. Because I knew exactly what he meant, had felt the same impossible nostalgia for moments that had never happened, for a version of ourselves we had never allowed to exist. I've had dreams too, I said quietly. Different dreams, but the same feeling. Like remembering a conversation we never had. He turned to look at me then, and in the starlight, I could see something in his expression that was both vulnerable and relieved, as though my admission had given him permission to believe his own experience was real. What conversation? He asked. The one where we admitted that we've been circling around this for years. The one where we stopped pretending that friendship was enough. The words emerged before I could stop them, carrying with them years of careful restraint and unexamined longing. I had never allowed myself to think these thoughts so clearly, let alone speak them aloud. But something about this place, this moment, this man beside me in the darkness, made honesty feel not just possible, but necessary. Damien's breathing changed, became deeper, more deliberate. When he spoke, his voice carried a wonder that made my chest tighten. How long have you known? He asked. Known what? That I've been in love with my best friend for longer than I can remember? That every time you touch me casually, I have to remind myself it doesn't mean what I want it to mean? That I've built my entire life around the safe distance of friendship, because I was too afraid to risk losing you. I don't know if I've known anything, I said instead, but I've suspected. I've wondered. I've watched you with other people and felt something that had no name. He nodded slowly, as though my words confirmed something he had long suspected himself. We were quiet again, but the silence felt different now, charged with acknowledgement rather than avoidance. The lake stretched away from us, a dark mirror that held the stars and our reflections in equal measure. In my dreams, Damien said eventually we were here, always here, as though this place was where we were supposed to figure it out. I thought about that, about the way this cabin had always felt separate from the rest of the world, a place where different rules applied, about the way we had both changed since arriving, becoming more honest, more willing to risk the comfortable patterns that had protected us for so long. Maybe, I said, we needed somewhere safe to be scared. He laughed quietly at that, a sound that carried both humor and recognition. Are you? He asked. Scared. Terrified, I admitted. But not of this. Not of you. What then? Of going back. Of pretending this weekend didn't happen. Of spending the rest of my life wondering what would have been different if we had been brave enough to find out. He reached over then, slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. When I didn't, his hand found mine in the darkness, fingers intertwining with a certainty that felt like muscle memory. We don't have to go back, he said quietly. Not to pretending, anyway. His thumb traced across my knuckles, a touch so gentle it made my throat tight with emotion. We sat there holding hands in the starlight, two men who had spent years dancing around the truth, finally allowing ourselves to acknowledge what had always been there. The lake reflected our silence back to us, patient and eternal. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called across the water, its voice wild and haunting. But here on the porch, with Damien's hand warm in mine, the sound felt less like loneliness and more like recognition, as though the night itself was acknowledging that something important had shifted in the darkness. When we finally went back inside, we moved differently, with an awareness of each other that had not existed before. At the narrow hallway between the bedroom and the living room, we paused, hands still linked, both of us understanding that whatever happened next would change everything. Neither of us was ready for that change, not yet. But as we separated for what remained of the night, as he squeezed my hand gently before letting go, I knew that, ready or not, the conversation we had been avoiding for years had finally begun. Morning came too soon, carrying with it the weight of decisions we were not ready to make. I woke to find Damien already moving quietly around the kitchen, packing supplies with the methodical efficiency of someone trying to keep his hands busy. The air between us hummed with everything we had said in the darkness, every confession that now had to survive the harsh light of day. We worked in careful synchronization, dismantling the weekend we had built together. The tools went back into their cases, the leftover food into coolers, the evidence of our temporary domestic life erased with each item we loaded into his truck. Neither of us spoke about the night before, as though naming it might make it too fragile to survive the journey back to the world. But I caught him watching me as I folded the quilt he had wrapped around himself on the porch, his eyes holding a question he did not dare ask. When our hands brushed as he took the quilt from me, the touch carried the same electric recognition as before, proof that nothing had been imagined, that the conversation in the Starlight had been real. The drive back began in silence that felt different from our usual comfortable quiet. This silence was loaded, pregnant with words we had spoken and words we had not yet found the courage to say. The radio played softly between us, filling the space with music that neither of us was really hearing. For the first hour, we maintained the pretense that this was just another weekend, just another adventure in our long history of shared experiences. Damien pointed out a hawk circling over the highway. I mentioned a book I thought he might like. We discussed the repairs still needed at the cabin, making plans as though everything between us remained exactly as it had always been. But as the miles accumulated and the city grew closer, the weight of returning to our separate lives began to press against the fragile truth we had constructed. I watched the landscape change from wilderness to farmland to suburbs, each mile taking us further from the place where honesty had felt possible. It was Damien who finally broke, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as we passed the sign marking the city limits. "I think the dream was just me telling myself what I've been afraid to say," he said, his voice carefully controlled. The words came out in a rush, as though he had been rehearsing them for miles. I felt my chest tighten with something that might have been relief or might have been terror. He was not going to let us pretend the weekend had been a beautiful aberration, something we could file away and never examine again. Which was what? I asked, though I thought I knew. That I've been in love with you for longer than I can remember. That every time we say goodbye, I have to remind myself not to kiss you. That I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and it scares the hell out of me. The confession hung in the air between us like smoke, visible and substantial. I could feel him waiting for my response, could sense the tension in his shoulders as he navigated traffic while laying his heart bare. "I haven't stopped thinking about it either," I said quietly. "Not the dream, but what you said. What we said." He glanced at me quickly, then back at the road, his jaw working as though he was holding back everything else he wanted to say. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means I think we've been lying to ourselves for years. It means when you touch me, I forget how to breathe. It means I've built my entire life around being close to you without being too close, and I'm tired of pretending that's enough." The words felt dangerous in my mouth, too honest for the daylight world we were returning to. But they were also liberating, as though speaking them aloud had released something I had been holding captive for too long. Damien's breathing changed, became deeper, more deliberate. When he spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability that made my chest ache. "So what do we do now?" He asked, "How do we go back to being friends when we've admitted we're not just friends?" I did not have an answer for that. The question felt enormous, capable of reshaping everything we had built together over more than a decade. Our friendship had been the most stable thing in my life, the one relationship I had never questioned or doubted. The thought of risking it, of potentially losing him entirely, made my stomach clench with fear. But the thought of continuing to pretend, of going back to the careful distance we had maintained for so long, felt equally impossible now that we had tasted what honesty might offer. I don't know, I admitted, but I know I can't unknow this. I can't go back to pretending I don't feel what I feel. We had reached the familiar streets of our neighborhood, the ordinary world of traffic lights and strip malls and the comfortable mundanity of Sunday afternoon. Damien's truck moved through it all with mechanical precision, but I could feel him struggling with the same questions that were tearing at me. When we pulled up outside my apartment, neither of us moved to get out. We sat in the cab of his truck, the engine ticking as it cooled, while the weight of decision pressed down on us. "I should go," I said finally, though I made no move toward the door. "Yeah," he agreed, though his hands remained on the steering wheel. We looked at each other then, really looked, and I saw my own fear and hope reflected in his eyes. This moment felt like a fulcrum, a point of balance where everything we had been and everything we might become hung in careful suspension. Damien started to speak, stopped, then tried again. "Come over tomorrow," he said, the words coming out careful and deliberate. "We'll talk, really talk, about what this means, about what we want it to mean." His eyes searched my face as though looking for some sign that I would not disappear overnight, that I would not wake up tomorrow and decide that safety was more important than truth. "Okay," I said, and the word felt like a promise, like a commitment to see this through regardless of where it might lead. I gathered my bag from the back seat, my movements slow and reluctant. When I reached for the door handle, Damien's voice stopped me. "Elias," he said, and when I turned back, his expression was serious, almost solemn. "Whatever happens, I need you to know that this weekend." What we said, it's the most honest I've ever been with anyone. About anything. The words hit me with unexpected force, carrying with them the weight of years of friendship and the fragile hope of something more. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to speak. As I walked toward the bookstore, I could hear his truck idling behind me, but I did not turn around. I climbed the stairs to my apartment with legs that felt unsteady, my key shaking slightly as I unlocked the door. Only when I heard his truck finally pull away did I allow myself to lean against the closed door and acknowledge the magnitude of what had just happened. We had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, admitted truths that could not be taken back. Tomorrow, we would have to decide whether we were brave enough to see where those truths might lead. The apartment felt different somehow, smaller and more isolated than it had when I left on Friday morning. I stood at my kitchen window, looking down at the empty street where his truck had been, and tried to imagine what tomorrow's conversation might bring. For the first time in years, I could not predict what Damien and I would say to each other. For the first time in my carefully constructed life, I had no idea what came next. The uncertainty should have terrified me, but instead, as I made coffee in my chipped mug and watched evenings settle over the city, I found myself almost eager to find out. That night stretched ahead of me like an ocean I had to cross alone. I moved through my evening routine with deliberate care, each familiar action anchoring me to the reality of what had changed. The coffee in my chipped mug tasted different somehow, sharper, as though even my senses had been altered by the weekend's revelations. I tried to read, but the words on the page refused to arrange themselves into meaning. I tried to grade the papers that had been waiting on my kitchen table since Friday, but the red pen felt foreign in my hand, the students' essays about love and loss in literature suddenly too close to my own experience to evaluate objectively. Instead, I found myself standing at my kitchen window, looking down at the empty street where Damien's truck had been parked hours earlier. The street lamp cast its familiar pale circle of light on the asphalt, and I wondered if he was somewhere across town having the same sleepless night, the same internal reckoning with what we had admitted to each other. The apartment felt smaller than it had before, as though the careful boundaries of my solitary life had been revealed as arbitrary constructions rather than necessary protections. The books on their shelves, the papers scattered across my table, the routine I had built so meticulously over the years. All of it seemed suddenly insufficient, like a life designed for someone I was no longer sure I wanted to be. I thought about the dream Damien had described, the one where we were different, more honest versions of ourselves. But sitting in my kitchen with cold coffee and the weight of tomorrow's conversation pressing against my chest, I realized I had been carrying a dream of my own for longer than I cared to admit. It was not the dramatic dream of movies or novels, not a fantasy of grand gestures or declarations. It was quieter than that, more domestic. I had dreamed of Sunday mornings that stretched lazily into afternoon, of shared coffee and comfortable silence. I had dreamed of someone who knew the way I folded my shirts and still found reasons to stay. I had dreamed of hands that reached for me in the darkness, not out of passion alone, but out of the simple desire for connection. I had dreamed of Damien looking at me the way he had looked at me by the fire, with recognition and acceptance, and something that might have been love. The realization hit me with surprising gentleness. This was not a revelation that changed everything so much as it was an acknowledgement of something that had been true for so long I had stopped noticing it. Like the way you can live with a sound for years before suddenly hearing it clearly. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of a clock, the rhythm of your own breathing. I had been in love with Damien Keller for most of the time I had known him. Not the desperate, consuming love of youth, but something deeper and more patient. A love that had learned to exist in the spaces between friendship and longing, that had taught itself to be grateful for proximity when intimacy seemed impossible. Now, with tomorrow's conversation looming like a door I could choose to walk through or leave forever closed, I had to decide whether I was brave enough to stop protecting myself from the possibility of loss and start protecting myself from the certainty of regret. I made fresh coffee and sat at my kitchen table, spreading the weekend's memories before me like photographs. Damien's uncertainty in the laundromat, the careful way he had extended the invitation to the cabin, the sight of him wrapped in a quilt under the stars, his confession by the fire, the weight of his hand in mine, the way his voice had broken when he admitted he had been afraid to say what he felt. Each memory carried its own weight, its own argument for why tomorrow's conversation mattered more than my fear of what it might cost us. We had spent 11 years building something beautiful and sustainable, but we had also spent 11 years settling for less than what we both wanted. The thought of losing him terrified me, but the thought of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if we had been brave enough to find out terrified me more. I must have dozed in my chair sometime after midnight, because I woke to sunlight streaming through the kitchen window and the sound of Mrs. Henderson opening the bookstore below. My neck ached from sleeping upright, and the coffee in my mug had long since gone cold, but something in my chest felt lighter than it had in years. I showered and dressed with more care than usual, though I cannot have said why. Perhaps because I understood that this conversation with Damien would mark a turning point, regardless of its outcome. Perhaps because I wanted to look like someone worthy of the risk he was taking by asking me to come over, by suggesting we talk honestly about what we wanted our lives to look like. As I walked the 6 blocks to his apartment, the city felt different around me. The same streets I had traveled countless times suddenly seemed full of possibility, as though the very air had been charged with potential. I thought about all the times I had made this walk over the years, all the conversations we had shared, all the careful distances we had maintained. When I reached his building, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at his windows. I could see movement behind the glass, the familiar shape of him moving through the space I knew almost as well as my own. In a few minutes, I would climb those stairs, and we would sit across from each other and decide what shape our lives would take. I thought about the dream he had described, about feeling like he remembered a life where we were braver, more honest, more willing to risk everything for the possibility of having everything. Standing there in the morning light, I realized that dream did not have to remain a dream. I climbed the stairs with steady steps, my heart beating a rhythm that felt less like fear and more like anticipation. When I reached his door, I did not hesitate before knocking. Whatever came next, whatever we decided in the conversation that awaited us, I was ready to find out. For the first time in years, I was ready to stop protecting myself from my own life and start living it instead. The morning stretched ahead of us, full of words we had never said and truths we had never tested. I knocked on Damien's door and waited for him to answer, knowing that when he did, everything would begin.